The chandeliers glowed above the marble hall, pouring golden light across the tables where the wealthiest business leaders laughed over glasses of wine. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between polished shoes and glittering gowns, the air buzzing with arrogance and power. This was the annual charity gala hosted by Harrington Enterprises, where the elite gathered to be seen, to flaunt their wealth, and to pretend generosity. At the center of it all sat Richard Harrington, the CEO, known for his towering presence and sharp tongue. He thrived on mockery, always making jokes at the expense of those he thought beneath him. Tonight, his eyes landed on someone who didn't belong, at least not in his world. The boy was quiet, standing near the wall with his grandmother. His suit was too big, the sleeves nearly covering his small hands. His shoes were polished but clearly old, creased at the toes. The guest noticed him immediately, whispering and smirking. What was a poor black boy doing in such a hall of privilege? Richard leaned back in his chair, smirk tugging at his lips. "You there," he said loud enough for the crowd to hear, pointing his glass toward the boy. "You look like you're here to serve drinks, but wait, maybe you're here to entertain us. Why don't you sit at that piano and give us a show?" The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. Some guests covered their mouths. Others clapped, encouraging the spectacle. The grandmother stiffened, clutching her grandson's shoulder, whispering, "Elijah, you don't have to." But the boy's wide eyes met hers. Something in him, a mixture of fear and pride, pushed him forward. The grand piano stood at the corner of the stage, untouched all night, its surface reflecting the lights like a mirror. Elijah's footsteps echoed as he walked toward it, each step heavier than the last. The crowd expected disaster, their smiles wide, eager for humiliation. Richard leaned forward, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Play something we'll remember." Elijah's hands trembled as he sat on the bench. For a moment, his reflection on the black surface of the piano showed not just a nervous boy, but the years behind him. Nights spent in a cramped apartment practicing on a second-hand keyboard with missing keys. His grandmother working long hours just to keep food on the table. The sound of laughter pressed against him like a wave, but then, in his mind, he heard her voice. "Music is your gift, Elijah. Don't let anyone steal it from you." His fingers hovered above the keys. The room grew restless. "Well, don't keep us waiting," someone shouted, and laughter erupted again. Richard chuckled, certain this boy would stumble, would confirm his place at the bottom. But as Elijah pressed the first key, something shifted. A single note filled the hall, pure and haunting. It silenced a few voices, enough for the second note to follow, then a third. His trembling eased, replaced by a steady rhythm, as though his soul had been waiting for this exact moment. The laughter faded into whispers. The boy who had been mocked was no longer small, no longer out of place. Each chord carried pain, hope, and defiance. Though it had only begun, the crowd leaned in, realizing they had misjudged him. Richard's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected music like this. He hadn't expected power from someone he thought powerless. What began as a cruel joke was turning into something unforgettable. And Elijah, the boy they underestimated, was just getting started. The sound of Elijah's first notes still lingered in the air, but before we see where the music takes him, we must understand the journey that brought him to this very stage. Elijah Turner was no stranger to whispers. From the day he stepped into the world, life seemed eager to remind him of his place. He grew up in Eastwood, a neighborhood forgotten by the city, where broken streetlights flickered and cracked sidewalks told stories of struggle. His mother, a gentle woman with a laugh that could chase away storms, passed away when Elijah was only 5. The illness took her quickly, leaving behind only memories and a tiny locket that Elijah wore close to his chest. His father had disappeared long before, leaving Elijah in the care of his grandmother, Martha. She was a strong woman, her hands hardened from years of scrubbing floors and doing laundry for others. Each wrinkle on her face told a story of sacrifice, and yet when she looked at Elijah, her eyes softened with pride. She would always say, "You are more than what this world sees. Don't forget that." Life was not kind to them. Money was scarce, and every day was a fight between bills and survival. But in the corner of their small apartment stood an old second-hand piano. The keys were yellowed, some chipped, some refusing to work at all. It had been Martha's gift, bought with months of saved wages, because she had seen how Elijah's face lit up whenever music filled the air. That piano became his escape, his secret world where the noise of poverty and judgment couldn't reach him. Elijah taught himself night after night. He listened to music on an old radio, mimicking the sounds, repeating melodies until his fingers knew them by heart. When the world outside mocked him, when children at school sneered at his patched clothes or called him names, he returned to the piano. With every note, he poured out his pain, his loneliness, and his dreams. So when Elijah arrived at the grand gala that night, escorted by his grandmother through borrowed generosity of a small community scholarship, he already knew what it felt like to be judged. The whispers started the moment they walked in. Who invited them? Did they take a wrong turn? Look at his shoes. Each word cut deep, but Elijah kept his eyes down, holding his grandmother's hand tightly. And then came Richard Harrington, the CEO with the smirk that carried more weight than the whispers combined. Elijah could still feel the sting of that moment, the laughter of strangers, the mocking tone, the heavy silence as all eyes turned to him. To them, he was a joke, entertainment, a nobody who didn't belong among chandeliers and silk gowns. Yet here he was, sitting at a piano larger than any he had ever touched. His heart raced, his palms damp, but as he glanced at his grandmother standing tall despite the stares, he remembered every word she had spoken. He could almost hear her voice over the noise. Play, Elijah. Let them hear who you are. The crowd leaned in, some already whispering bets about how badly he would fail. Others pulled out their phones, ready to capture a spectacle. Richard crossed his arms, amused, waiting for the boy to stumble. But Elijah was not the same fragile child they thought he was. His wounds had shaped him, but they had also given him strength. His music was not just practice, it was survival. It was the language he used to speak when the world refused to listen. And as his fingers hovered above the keys once more, Elijah knew one thing for certain. This moment would not break him. It would define him. The room seemed to hold its breath. The guests leaned back in their velvet chairs, champagne glasses paused mid-air, waiting for the inevitable mistake that would seal the boy's humiliation. Even Richard Harrington, the CEO, smirked with cruel patience, as though the failure would amuse him more if it took a few extra seconds. Elijah closed his eyes. His heart pounded in his chest, a drum louder than the murmurs around him. His hands trembled above the keys, not because of fear alone, but because he understood the weight of this moment. Every whisper, every laugh, every look of pity or scorn he had endured in his short life pressed against him. Now, they thought he was weak, invisible, a joke. But deep inside, Elijah knew he carried something they could never see: music. Then it happened. His fingers pressed down, releasing a soft, haunting note that floated into the grand hall like a ghost. It was not clumsy, not hesitant. It was pure. A ripple of silence spread across the tables. The second note followed, then the third, weaving themselves together like threads of a story only Elijah could tell. The melody was quiet at first, delicate, almost fragile, but beneath it lay strength. Guests exchanged glances. The laughter stopped. Some leaned forward, puzzled. Others frowned, as if unable to accept what they were hearing. Richard's smirk twitched, his confidence unsettled by the unexpected beauty spilling into the air. Elijah forgot the crowd. In his mind, he was no longer in a ballroom filled with strangers. He was back in his grandmother's small apartment, sitting on the worn bench, practicing until his fingers ached. He could see his mother's face in his memory, hear her laughter, feel the warmth of her arms as she sang lullabies to him. Each note he played carried a piece of her, a fragment of the love he had lost too soon. The tempo shifted, his hands moving faster, more certain. The melody grew, filling the hall with layers of sorrow and hope, struggle and resilience. It was not just music, it was Elijah's voice, louder and truer than words could ever be. His pain, his dreams, his dignity, they were all there, echoing against the walls, wrapping themselves around every heart in the room. One by one, the guests stopped fidgeting. Phones that had been raised to record a failure now captured a miracle. A woman in pearls pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. A man who moments earlier had chuckled into his drink now sat frozen, his gaze fixed on the boy who was rewriting the night. Elijah's grandmother stood straighter, her wrinkled hands trembling, tears welling in her eyes. She had always known. She had always believed. And now, before the very people who had tried to belittle him, her grandson was showing the truth. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The amusement had drained from his face, replaced with disbelief. This was no joke. This was not entertainment at someone's expense. This was power, the kind of power money couldn't buy or arrogance couldn't silence. The final chords of the piece swelled, shaking the hall with their force. Elijah's body swayed with the rhythm, his face tilted upward, eyes still closed. For those minutes, he was not a boy in an ill-fitting suit. He was not poor. He was not mocked. He was a master of the room, commanding every soul with nothing but music. And when the last note rang out, it lingered like a prayer, stretching into silence so complete it felt holy. Elijah slowly opened his eyes. The hall was utterly still. Dozens of faces stared at him, no longer mocking, no longer dismissive. They were awed, undone, shaken. For the first time in his life, Elijah realized something powerful. They were listening. The silence in the grand hall was unlike anything Elijah had ever known. Dozens of eyes, once filled with amusement and cruelty, were now wide with astonishment. The boy they expected to stumble had filled the air with something none of them could deny, truth spoken through music. But Elijah wasn't finished. He placed his hands back on the keys, and this time the melody rose like a storm. It started softly, like rain tapping against glass, then grew bolder, fiercer, each note a declaration. His fingers moved faster, almost dancing, striking chords that rang with fire and pain. The sound echoed through the hall like thunder, demanding attention, demanding respect. Every note was a story. The aching lows carried the weight of nights when his grandmother skipped meals so he could eat. The soaring highs spoke of the moments when music became his only escape, his only friend. Between the crescendos and silences lived his entire journey, the grief of losing his mother, the loneliness of poverty, the sting of being mocked, and the quiet hope that somehow, one day, his gift would matter. The crowd was spellbound. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others leaned forward, tears already forming. The laughter from before seemed like a memory from another lifetime. Guests who once whispered insults now sat still, shaken by a realization that they had judged too quickly, too harshly. And then came the moment that cut through every heart. Elijah shifted into a melody his grandmother had hummed to him since childhood, a simple, gentle tune of love and survival. She gasped audibly, clutching her chest, tears streaming freely. Guests turned toward her, realizing she was not just an old woman in a borrowed dress, but the pillar who had carried this boy through storms. Richard Harrington, the CEO, sat rigid. His smirk had vanished completely. For the first time in years, he was speechless. His cruel joke had turned into his downfall. Around him, people began whispering, not mocking Elijah this time, but condemning Richard's arrogance. Phones captured not just Elijah's music, but the CEO's frozen face, a powerful contrast between pride and humility. The music grew wilder, filling the hall with raw energy. Elijah's body moved with the rhythm, his head tilted back, eyes closed, his soul pouring out through the keys. It was no longer about survival. It was about breaking chains, the chains of judgment, of poverty, of prejudice. Every note was a hammer shattering the walls people had built around him. Some guests stood to their feet, unable to stay seated. A woman whispered, "This is genius." Another man shook his head in disbelief, muttering, "He's not just talented, he's extraordinary." Applause began to ripple through the hall, soft at first, then louder, building as Elijah's music soared to its peak. When the final note crashed into silence, the hall erupted. Cheers thundered, applause roared, tears streamed down faces that once sneered at him. Strangers who had mocked him now clapped until their hands ached, some shouting, "Bravo! Encore!" Elijah slowly opened his eyes. For the first time, he looked out at the crowd not with fear, but with quiet strength. He saw faces shining with awe, others bent in shame. And then his gaze found his grandmother. She stood tall, tears streaking her cheeks, clapping harder than anyone else. In her eyes was the pride of 1,000 victories. Richard Harrington remained seated, his jaw tight, his pride crumbling in front of the very people he once commanded. He had wanted a joke. Instead, he had given the world a stage for a prodigy. Elijah rose from the bench, bowing slightly. The applause grew deafening, echoing through every corner of the hall. In that moment, he was no longer the boy in worn shoes and an oversized suit. He was the center of the universe, the boy who had turned humiliation into triumph. And for the first time in his life, Elijah knew he was free. The sound of clapping refused to fade. It was no longer polite applause. It was a storm, rising and crashing across the room like waves. Guests stood on their feet, some even shouting Elijah's name, though they had only just learned it. Strangers who once saw him as nothing more than an out-of-place child now cheered as if he were a star they had admired for years. Phones captured everything. Cameras zoomed in on the boy bowing beside the piano, his grandmother weeping with joy, and the stunned face of Richard Harrington, the man who had started the cruel joke. Clips spread instantly across the internet, shared from table to table, live-streamed by guests eager to prove they had witnessed the miracle in person. The whispers began, louder and sharper this time, but not aimed at Elijah. Can you believe Harrington mocked him? What a disgrace. He tried to humiliate the boy, and look what happened. Hard's power had always been in his voice, his ability to control rooms with arrogance and laughter. But now his silence betrayed him. Every guest could see it. The man who thought himself untouchable had been humbled by the very child he tried to ridicule. Elijah stepped away from the piano, but the crowd shouted for more. Play again. Encore. Their voices rose, refusing to let him leave. He looked to his grandmother, unsure. She nodded, tears glistening on her cheeks. Play for yourself, Elijah. Play for your mother. He returned to the keys. This time he chose a piece he had written in secret, a melody born from long nights when hunger gnawed at his stomach and loneliness pressed against his heart. The music swelled like hope itself, powerful and unstoppable. Guests wiped their eyes. A man in a tuxedo whispered, This is genius, not just talent. Genius. By the time Elijah struck the final chord, the ovation was deafening. Some guests climbed onto chairs to clap louder. Others rushed forward, eager to shake his hand. His grandmother held her face in her hands, overwhelmed, whispering prayers of gratitude. Within minutes, opportunities poured in. A music professor from a renowned academy pushed through the crowd, begging for Elijah's name and contact. That boy belongs on the world stage, he insisted. A wealthy patron pledged to sponsor Elijah's education. Reporters scribbled notes, already crafting headlines. From joke to genius, boy stuns gala with piano performance. And yet, amidst the applause, all eyes eventually turned back to Richard Harrington. Cameras caught his every twitch, his forced smile, his inability to clap. The crowd expected him to speak, to apologize, to acknowledge the truth. But pride held him frozen. His joke had cost him dignity, and the world was watching. Elijah, however, did not look at Richard. He looked at the piano, at his grandmother, at the strangers whose tears proved that music could break walls of prejudice. For once, he didn't feel small. He didn't feel out of place. He felt powerful because he had not just played music. He had rewritten the story they had written for him. The ovation went on, refusing to stop. The boy who walked in invisible now stood taller than every chandelier in the room. The ovation echoed long after Elijah lifted his hands from the keys. For a moment it felt as though the entire hall had been transformed. No one saw him as the poor boy with worn shoes anymore. They saw a prodigy, a voice of truth that had silenced arrogance and forced every person in the room to confront their prejudice. But one figure remained frozen. Richard Harrington. His face was pale, his jaw clenched. The cameras caught every twitch, every flicker of pride that refused to bend. Yet he could not escape. The guests turned their eyes on him, waiting for a response. The man who had mocked Elijah into playing now had no choice but to face the music. Finally, a brave voice rose from the back. "Aren't you going to apologize?" A ripple of murmurs followed. "You humiliated him. Say something." Another voice added, "This boy just showed more class and power than you ever have." The weight of judgment pressed heavily on Richard. For years he had commanded respect through fear and wealth, but tonight respect had shifted to a boy he had tried to belittle. His empire of arrogance cracked in front of everyone. Slowly, unwillingly, he stood. His hands trembled as he clapped twice, empty, hollow sounds. "Remarkable," he forced out, but no one was fooled. The applause that followed was not for him. It was for Elijah. Elijah glanced at Richard, not with anger but with quiet strength. Then he turned to the microphone placed near the piano. His voice was soft, but the silence made every word sharp. "You laughed at me before I played. You thought I didn't belong here. All my life people have judged me for my skin, my clothes, my place in this world. But music doesn't care about any of that. Music sees the heart, and tonight you heard mine." The crowd erupted again, louder, prouder, standing not just for his music, but for his courage. His grandmother sobbed openly, clutching her hands in prayer, whispering, "Thank you, Lord." Within hours, clips of the performance flooded social media. Headlines screamed across the internet. CEO tries to mock black boy, regrets it instantly. From joke to genius, Elijah's music stuns the world. Millions watched the video, not to see Richard Harrington's gala, but to see the boy who turned cruelty into triumph. Opportunities poured in like a flood. Scholarships, invitations to perform on global stages, letters from musicians, activists, and even politicians who praised him for his strength. Overnight, Elijah became more than a boy at a piano. He became a symbol of resilience, of dignity, of justice served. As for Richard, the fallout was brutal. Investors questioned his leadership. Employees whispered about his arrogance. His reputation, once untouchable, was now linked forever to the video of a CEO mocking a child and being humbled in front of the world. His silence that night became his loudest failure. But Elijah's victory was not measured in Richard's downfall. It was measured in the faces of those who stood and clapped, in the messages of children who said, "I want to play piano too," in the pride shining from his grandmother's eyes. He had proven not just to the world but to himself that no amount of prejudice could bury true talent. On the way home, Elijah sat beside his grandmother on the bus, still wearing the oversized suit, still holding her hand. She whispered, "You changed them tonight, Elijah, but more importantly, you changed yourself." He smiled, looking out the window at the city lights flickering like stars. "No," he said softly, "the music did." And from that night on, no one ever looked at Elijah Turner the same way again.